Um, Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for your time today. We appreciate your attention. We think this is going to be a useful webinar, particularly for those who are in planning for CECL. So if you're a 2020 bank, it's going to give you an idea of how your journey hopefully is mostly complete. And if you're a 2022 bank, this is a look at what could be expected for your future under the CECL regime. So just a quick ad, as we must do. Ardmore Banking Advisors, who I'm a partner of this firm. We're a credit risk consulting firm focused on community-sized institutions. We help banks with all aspects of credit risk management. We have three different groups within the firm, divisions. We do loan review, outsourced and co-sourced loan review for banks all over the nation using our remote access software. We also do consulting, where we help institutions either who are under agreements or who are looking for updated policies or procedures and due diligence. And we also have Credit Technology Group, which includes myself, where we support community banks who are trying to automate their credit risk management. We've been partners with CSI for over 7 years, and you may have seen us at the CSI customer conference, which we've attended and sponsored for the last 7. Argus Information Systems is a software provider that CSI and Ardmore have partnered with to deliver CECL solutions directly connected to CSI. So we are the only endorsed CECL partner. And as I mentioned, if you choose our solutions, the data will flow directly from CSI into the solution. So it takes a whole layer of resource away from the bank having to provide. Okay, so together, CSI, Argus, and Ardmore, we create a best-of-breed solution for CSI banks. And we have a right-sized solution set, so we're not going to try to convince a bank to overbuy or over-engineer. We simply want to provide services that banks need. All right, so that's the end of the advertising. Welcome to the next leg of the CECL journey, CECL transition project planning for community banks. And I do have to say happy Valentine's Day to all of you out there. Before we get started, we're going to start out with a poll, which we often do. And I think this is useful because we can publish these results and they are anonymous. But the first poll is really going to be about where you are on your CECL journey. So you're going to see this pop up on the screen, and we'd appreciate it greatly if you would just, click a button if you can, give us an idea of kind of where you are on the journey. This helps us understand, how our banks are progressing through the process, and also, we can tailor what we cover today a little more specifically for banks who are in a different where they are on the journey. This particular webinar is going to be very tactical. We're going to be just talking about what you can do to get ready and also meet regulatory expectations around preparing for CECL. As you probably know, you're being asked this now, no matter when you're a 2020 bank or 2022 bank. Regulators want to know that you have a plan, and we're going to talk about specifically how to do that. Okay, I think just about everybody's voted, and we're going to show you those results. And you can see here that the banks attending, we have kind of a pretty mixed bag here, and with about a quarter of you not started yet. So we'll take a look at that and compare it to the last time we talked for those of you who attended and get a sense of how things are shifting. So thanks. We're going to have to do another poll near the end. We'll ask you some other questions just to, again, get you involved. Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Matt, helping out with that poll. All right. So hopefully you can see the screen. Now, why do we project plan? Let's talk about why we need to do this. Project planning is, an art to some degree, but it's really creating a formal documented plan that can serve a number of purposes. So the first is, what are we trying to accomplish? We can document this and use it as a communication device so we can share it with other stakeholders in the process. As you'll see in the project plan, that's the first thing you need to do. So it's a little difficult to convince people to help you or get involved if you can't explain what it is that you're trying to achieve. So it sets expectations and tells people involved what you're going to do and when. It can act as a roadmap. So, we're going to talk about this. How do you get from where you are today to CECL compliance when you have to be there? What are the steps and milestones you have to achieve? You can also use it as a yardstick to say, have we gotten where we thought we would be by now? And how far behind are we, which is the most likely result to that question. And what do we have to do to catch up? And finally, it shows that you're underway. I noticed that we had almost a quarter of the banks who voted are telling us they haven't started yet. At least if you have a plan, you can show regulators and your auditors that you have an idea of what you're going to do, what your goals are. So having a project plan really is going to pay off in a number of areas. And for CECL in particular, having a project plan is pretty important. CECL, the transition from the incurred loss model of the ALLL to the CECL model is a difficult thing, and therefore the more clarity you can give and more evidence of your preparation, the better. Typically, this is a wholly new process for institution. It's a wholly new process for the entire marketplace. No one has done a CECL calculation in production. The only ones who are running parallel are a very few larger community banks and some of the regionals and super regionals who are at this point looking to run parallel. So it's a new process, which means that having some guardrails and some definition on what you're going to do is pretty important. It impacts many different departments in the bank. So you've got a lot of stakeholders in this process. At the top of your head, you may think, well, finance and credit risk, we can handle this. But as you'll see, as we talk about each one of these aspects, it's a lot. And when you have a lot of different people involved, you know how that is. A lot of cooks in the kitchen, a lot of people who are impacted, a lot of resources that you need that probably aren't available to you just because you asked for them. It will be important to have a plan to show them. The interdependencies are also pretty clear. You'll get to a point where you won't be able to go forward without help from someone else. So having a plan where everyone can see where they fit in is useful. Plus, this is a multi-year complex process. It's not like shooting a rocket to the moon, but as the moon has better definition than CECL, but it is a long, complex process. So having a clear plan can keep you on target. And as I mentioned before, there is an ongoing regulatory and audit expectation that you have a plan. Now, this plan can be as detailed or rudimentary as you feel comfortable. What I'll lay out are some milestones that I think are pretty useful for a plan for CECL. It's up to you to decide how you want to communicate that. You may keep the detailed plan to yourself for your internal use on the project and only put a high level out there for regulators and auditors. It's really up to you. But there is an expectation. My understanding from talking to some banks is that the OCC, during their safety and soundness, gives you, in effect, a questionnaire. And I'll just stop and do an editorial at this point to mention, if you haven't seen my article that was published 2 weeks ago in the American Banker, I have been complaining pretty loudly that the auditors and regulators are asking a lot of questions, but not giving a lot of answers to community banks and smaller financial institutions. So I have a feeling that it's project plans that you create are going to become part of really defining what a CECL implementation is. I think there should be more guidance coming from the regulators and auditors. I know, I should say, CECL is a financial standard put together by FASB. It is not a regulation. So regulators certainly didn't create this CECL regime, but they are the ones who have to enforce it. And I would think the very least they can do is share with you what their expectations are. And finally, documentation of decision making. One of the things that we have seen that's been documented as a best practice in CECL is that your narrative is going to have to outline the steps you took to become CECL compliant. If you have a project plan, that'll give you a guide as to what decisions you have to make when. So you can document those decisions so that they go with your project plan into your narrative, and you can say, this is when the CECL committee got together and decided this. We considered these different options, and we chose this for this reason. That's part of what the expectations are, so you might as well get started with that in mind. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about key project planning components. What are the concepts for you to consider? First, really start with the two ends of the project. Here you are in mid-February 2019, and you know that in 2022, if you're a non-public business entity, you'll have to be ready to go in March. That would typically be for most banks that have fiscal year ends in December. How do you get from here to there is obviously the roadmap that you have to build. If you're a non-PBE, but you have some privately held concerns, you may be a 2021 bank. If by now you're not sure whether you're 2021, 2022, or 2020, you better check with your auditors. So once you want to start with the two ends, you know what it looks like when you're compliant as best as you can, and you know where you are today as best as you can. What are the major milestones to get from here to there? What dates make sense to hit as you go through those milestones, considering how long it's going to take. So a long-term task like collection of data, analysis of your capabilities and where you have gaps, that may take you, 6 months. Deciding on what kind of pools you want to create, that might only take a month. So you have to think about the major milestones are between here and there and how long each one's going to take and what one precedes the other, or whether you can run them in parallel. And then you have to consider ownership, responsibilities, department of the bank. You might be looking to internal audit for controls, where you might be looking to IT for data and bank ops for coding. So you really want to start thinking about where you want to bring in these other involved parties and assigning them ownership of certain tasks, getting their buy-in. What is the critical path and what are the dependencies? If you don't know what data you have, it's pretty hard to go out and improve your data for collection for CECL. If you don't know what the coding standards are, it's pretty hard for you to establish new ones. So you got to kind of think about the key things you need to do, and I'm going to give you a list of an example of those shortly. And then basically you're going to flesh out the subtasks underneath the main tasks. Once you figure out what the main things are, then there are going to be some obvious things underneath those that are the tasks that go up to the milestone and the dates they have to be done to hit that target. And perform regular updates. This is something that gets lost sometimes, but as I mentioned, since you're going to be looked at as, did you create a plan? Are you following the plan? What decisions did you make? All that should be documented and should be published out so that if people say, hey, you missed something, or I never saw that, when that decision was made, you have documentation all the way through the process. Your project manager should be doing that as part of the process. All right, so with that as sort of a primer on project management, let's talk about CECL project management components. So when you're building your CECL transition plan to get from February 2019 to March 2022 or 21, depending what your status is, as I mentioned, you start with the two ends, and you really want to figure out where you are. That was one of the reasons why we asked that first poll question. When you decide where you are, then you can proceed. So let's look at some milestones for you to think about with CECL. I broke it into 8 major milestones, and we'll talk about each one next. They include identifying your project resources and planning your project. Data and data remediation for CECL is critical and an early first step because of its long duration and lead time. Segmentation and pooling considerations. The buy or build decision on the estimation methodology and process, and choosing how to calculate your life of loan and what loss projection methodologies for life of loan loss you want to use. Q&E factors is a huge issue, which we'll talk about. Then reporting, justification, documentation. If anything is clear about CECL, it's that there's got to be a lot of that because it's very subjective by design so that banks can choose the strategies and methodologies that they want. But that means everything has to be justified and quote, reasonable, supportable, unquote. And finally, parallel runs before you get going. So let's look at each of these. Okay, the first one is, what are my project resources and what is the ongoing plan? I think this is the first major challenge for most smaller institutions because typically smaller institutions don't have extra resources available to them to say, okay, you go down to the basement and work on CECL. You know, most people are wearing multiple hats, and there isn't a lot of extra resource going around that can just jump in and take over. This is why a lot of institutions look to third parties that are trusted to supply them with resources needed to help them get going and keep the project going. But some of the resources you might consider, obviously accounting and finance are involved. Different banks do CECL in different places, CFOs, CEOs in some cases, chief credit officers, but obviously accounting and finance has to be involved in the process because it impacts the capital of the bank at minimum, and it may be their responsibility at maximum. External audit, I've talked to literally hundreds of banks over the last 2 years, and most of them tell me their external audit firms are not giving them a lot of specific direction. But some of them are telling them certain things like you should be ready for this, or maybe you need to think about more risk-based pooling, or here's an outline that we think you should follow. So project plans and things like that. So obviously they need to be involved. Your core system provider, we're already working with CSI, and we've helped them develop both a data retention plan to ensure that they're retaining your data longer than they were before. So when you're ready, a lot of it's already there. But also other third-party vendors you may choose to work with, whether it's Ardmore or others, they could be important resources. Risk management team, if there is one in the bank specifically, that could be credit risk management or could be overall risk management. But obviously the credit group is important in this. They're the ones who are going to give you the details on the portfolio. And as you know, in CECL, there's a lot of projections of performance based on previous performance in similar market cycles. Lending is impacted. I saw an article in the American Banker a couple of weeks ago where somebody said, oh my gosh, CECL is going to have a huge impact on lending products because everybody's going to be doing short-term products or products that are re-underwritten periodically so that the life of loan is shorter and life of loan loss is less. It's also going to be interesting for experience for lenders to be told, you know, we think there's a bubble coming, a downturn ahead, so we're going to start adding more reserves. Under CECL, we can do that in anticipation of a problem, but that means your pricing is going to go, and it's going to be tough for you to make your incentives, even though the economy right now looks good. So lending is going to be involved. IT, obviously, we need to get data flowing into databases. We need secure, auditable places to put your information off-core. Internal audit from a control standpoint and support. And loan operations, is it probably most banks are going to find, and we have working with CSI banks, more data needs to be gathered at the time of origination. And for these resources, they're going to want to understand how am I impacted? If you want people to buy in and support you, they have to believe that it has some impact on them. Has an impact on the bank and the health of the bank and an impact on them. You need to get their buy-in, at least enough buy-in that they will show up for the meetings and listen. Hopefully enough buy-in that they'll actually take ownership over certain tasks that relate to them. Sometimes buy-in can be enforced from above. I mean, this is a regulatory supported initiative and a financial standard that you have to follow. So it's pretty hard to opt out if you don't have a choice. And identify owners by area. You really want to have members of your CECL team. You don't need to have every single person involved in CECL in a room when you go through these different segments of the plan, but you need somebody who is the leader for the area. And again, size of bank and complexity has an impact on this. So Getting your project resources lined up and circulating your plan with them impacts obviously timelines, deliverables, and also expectations for within the bank and within auditor and regulatory people. Okay, so second concept, a major milestone to think about is data and data remediation. If you've attended any CECL webinars to date, you've heard this to the point where it probably just sounds like noise, but I can't underline how important it is. And I noticed in our poll, looks like a good number of people have really started to look at their data. I was quite happy the other day when we had a new CSI bank in our boot camp, which we'll talk about at the end, and they told me that when they heard about it last summer, they started collecting data like appraisal values and debt to income ratios and credit scores and putting them into the core, into CSI. That's critical. You can collect them and they can be sitting in your loan files, but if they're not in a secure data source and you can't pull them out in an automated way, they're really not there. So you need an assessment, which you can do internally. Ardmore does these assessments. We've done them for about 3 years now, where we go in and look at a bank's data, identify completeness issues, quality issues, good to have for CECL. If you buy either of our CECL solutions, Ardmore does this for you as part of that at no additional cost. We can also do that as a standalone process, but you can even do it yourself. The important thing is, do you know what fields are recommended for CECL and what are good to have? How do they relate to what you have? What are your gaps? What kind of coding standards and controls do you have in place? Who is checking those coding and standard? If someone is coding a loan as a multifamily property, it turns out it's a horse farm because there's multiple families of horses, who's looking at that and who's going to catch that? Didn't used to matter as much under CECL. It's going to matter a lot. There's going to need to be documentation on how you code a loan, and it can't be just a Xerox copy of codes that's been Xerox so many times it looks like a bunch of blobs. It's got to be clear who owns it, who checks it. That all has to get written down, flow charts put together, and quality and history. History is important because ultimately the big banks are looking at history through the whole cycle of an asset, and that includes a business cycle, which could be anywhere from 5 to 10 years. Obviously, most banks aren't going to be able to do that. So how much history you have versus your life of loan is very important. Okay, so once you've established your gaps and you want to go try to find if you have other historical data sources, we find clients have historical data sometimes locked away in databases inside the bank somewhere, an ALM system. Could be people have taken trial balances, snapshots quarterly as part of the ALLL process. Go and see what you got in history. That may not be necessarily in the core. For the go forward, you want to add more data. You should start looking at what you're retaining when you do origination and what you need to retain. It's now for a 2022 bank. If you have good data in 2019 and 2020 and 21, that's 3 years. It's a good pillar to stand on. Loan origination is where most of this data is available that you need for CECL, and in a lot of cases, it doesn't get put into any automated system. From a data management and control standpoint, document the process from credit approval to going to the core. We usually create flow charts where we look at the handoffs and how the data flows down to the core and out to reporting systems and eventually to management. And what kind of quality control is there? Who owns that quality control? And also consider, from a data standpoint, external and peer data. If you don't have loss history, if you don't have losses, the regulators have said you can use peer data, but you have to ask questions about whether or not it's reasonable or supportable to use as a proxy for your own loss history. And Q factors surrounding those. We'll talk about those in more detail. So this all impacts, the data impacts obviously your life of loan loss estimates, your future loss projections, and your disclosures and your justifications for your decision making and your rationale. So it's pretty crucial and an early step. Pooling, segmentation and pooling considerations. This is an early step for most of you who have very, um, pretty consistent call code based pooling for your ALLL today. That is probably where you're going to start with CECL. However, what the regulators have said is that over time they expect banks to consider a more risk-based pooling process. So, control codes and call codes are usually asset-based, and certainly different assets have different risk characteristics, but there are other characteristics that may be more important from a CECL perspective and also might serve to make your CECL estimate work better for you. And some of the objectives might be what we're showing here, which is when you first do your CECL estimation and it looks like it's a lot higher than what you expected, maybe by changing your pooling, you can bring it down. Possibly you can make it easier to calculate life of loan loss more accurately if you have different pooling methodologies, such as breaking things out by past, substandard, and doubtful, or taking non-recourse loans out. There's different methodologies and things you can look at. Our board would not recommend going through an exhaustive study of this unless we find out it's absolutely critical to do so, because it takes a lot of resource. I know of one bank that was told by their auditor, it was a larger community bank, that you should look at making your pools more risk-based, and they came back with 67 pools. I asked them why. I said, what were you trying to achieve by creating 67 pools? And they said, well, we don't know, but we wanted to make them more risk-based. So what happened was they ended up with some pools that had 12 loans in them. That's not particularly useful for doing a calculation of statistics or any kind of trending. So some of the concerns and things you'd think about would be, do you have the data consistently to use things like LTV or even risk rating to break apart your pools? How big or small are they? No pool should be under 100 loans or have no losses. There are some best practices that are evolving. And if you create new pools, that means your current loss history has to be rebuilt. And can you do that? We've done that exercise with a couple community banks. And also, I mentioned here impact on peer data, because if you decide to do some sophisticated pooling methodologies, you may not be able to use any peer data that's available because peer data is not organized that way. So there's things to think about. And again, this is important because it can impact what methodologies you use. It can impact capital and the usefulness of third-party data and the Q factors you use. Buy or build. All the things we've talked about up to this point are things you can do without going ahead and using vendors, although you can use vendors to help you, particularly consultants who can help you with some of these decisions. Ardmore can help you as well. But usually at a certain point you have to decide, do you want to try to build your own solution for this calculation, or do you want to go out and purchase it? I would say, by the way, the first 3 milestones are where it should be done this year. We'll show you a timeline in a minute, but this decision might be something you do next year. It really depends on how you want to manage the project. Internal models, there are concerns about controls. Certainly you can use spreadsheets to do this. There's a lot of data, however, that gets managed in the process, and all that has to be auditable, so it has to have controls, it has to be protected. You have to prove that no one's manipulating it. There's a clear lineage from the core to your spreadsheets, and that you're maintaining the data somewhere off the spreadsheet in something secure. Maintaining Excel formulas for, every quarter you have to update all your pools and retry your methodologies can be a lot of work to do manually. And you may not have anybody available to spend that amount of time. External models, you obviously have to worry about vendor selections, picking a trusted vendor who will be with you down the whole journey. Obviously budget and linkages to your core, CSI for most of you. Ease of understanding. I know one of the things that often when I talk to people who got it by our solutions is even the lingo is different. Somebody calls this an open pool, somebody calls this a cohort, somebody else calls it a snapshot. It can be made very complicated, but it doesn't have to be. And obviously flexibility as best practices are evolving. If you buy a product today and that product is pretty much hard coded into a certain methodology or process, when you have to pay for any kind of changes, you may be paying for quite a while as best practices evolve. So obviously this choice impacts your budget, your timeline, resources that you need, as well as controls. Like I said, you can put together controls around a manual internal process. They just have to be a lot more rigorous than if you have a controlled application. Okay, so number 7 really is your projection methodologies, life of loan loss projections, and what methodologies you do to calculate those loss rates. This is where a lot of banks, I think, kind of focused earlier on, and it's really just part of the solution. We've talked about some of the others, but obviously, I mean, our supported methodologies for the Argus tool are these. There are others. Some of them work better for some methodology, for some portfolios, than others. You'll have to test them all, more or less, or at least test a couple, and prove in your narrative that in your process you tested them, and the reason why you discarded some and chose others. And again, these can be by pool, not necessarily for every pool. You need to have data to support the selection of methodology. You may not even be able to do some of these based on data that you have available. And again, it may be the best fit for certain asset types. And this impacts, everything from the kind of data you have to your ability to do testing. Your choice of methodology is going to impact your reserve amounts and capital, and the volatility of your losses, your ACL. You're going to want to have a standard, relatively unvolatile process. The more volatility, the more troubles. Also, justification and controls around those methodologies is important. Q factors. This is number 6. Oh, I hear the regulators coming now. I believe that's the OCC. That's what they're best known for. So the Q and E factors can be alarming, but they are a way to tailor the calculated answers that come out of your process in CECL to something that you can actually manage. A friend of mine, Mike Gillette, who manages this whole area for the American Bankers Association, likes to say, CECL's easy until you get the answer you don't like, and it's the Q factors who can take your answer and make it something that you do like. So Q factors today, there's a set of them, or say 9 of them, that are regulatory acceptable. Under CECL, there are more of them because you're adding factors that have to do with looking into the future and projecting losses. So you could use these Q factors to attribute change in your ongoing CECL calculation, and they can help support the story with your data. We look at 4 groups of Q factors that you're going to have to deal with. There's still the 9 regulatory, but we're sort of looking at them. If you look at the ASU itself, they talk about, I think it's 26 different factors that you could consider. Mostly we group them into portfolio mix, about how your assets are mixed and the changes in that mix, and how different assets have different volatility and risk. Loan performance over time. This is where your data supports how your portfolio has performed and assets within it over time. We're considering seasoning of the portfolio, maturities, where you are on the loss curves, and the ages of your portfolio. And then forecasting, and also collateral values based on historical performance and what your projections are. All of these Q factors, you'll notice, have to be supported by some sort of data that supports your rationale that you can use in your narrative to justify your Q factors. You also, if you decide to use peer data or macroeconomic factors, you may be using Q factors to adjust those as well. One of the things that the regulators pointed out was that if you're going to use peer data as a proxy for a lack of data that you have, you're going to have to actually adjust that peer data for your portfolio and your kind of borrowers, because it's going to be, either a set of peers or other banks' information that needs to be modified be more realistic for you. And obviously the impact of the Q factors are pretty significant. Okay, and reporting and justification, documentation is a very important issue. There are new disclosure reports, new narrative reports. This is where you tell the story. And from all that we can tell, because of the subjective nature of this, it's probably the most important thing is to have a really good story that explains why you chose the decisions you did, why you used the Q factors you did, projections behind it, the periods that you chose, the different methodologies, all that has to be explained and documented. Here are some examples of the things you have to worry about. I've actually heard some auditors say that it's almost as if you should start with a narrative and then work backwards to justify the narrative using data, calculations, and supporting information. That reasonable supportable term that's all over that ASU talks to that and the rationale and supporting data for the decisions you made under CECL. So it's, the calculations is what people focus on, but what we focus on is this piece. So if you, for example, use a third-party product to do your calculation, there should be a slew of reports that you can use as your raw material to justify decision you made, Q factors you applied, a methodology you used. And they should be good reports that tell the story about your portfolio and tell it well. The rest is up to you. No vendor is going to write you the narrative. And the final project milestone is the parallel run. And I actually think parallel is a misnomer because even if you automate your current ALLL and then you automate your CECL, they're going to be very different. You may have different pools. You're certainly going to have different factors, different Q factors. I really consider it simultaneous runs more than parallel runs because you're really just looking at the impact mostly on capital and the process to get to the goal, not so much running apples to apples comparison. But things that you may want to test in the parallel runs would be the best pooling mechanisms, the best loss rates, projection methodologies, whether or not using peer data is helpful or not, and then comparing those results. What happens when you run those through a model, whether it's your spreadsheet or whether it's through a third-party vendor, what needs to be adjusted, what needs to be changed. Obviously, there are huge impacts. One of the things that a lot of the larger banks learned who did this sort of thing internationally with the International Foreign Standard ISR9 was that they ran out of time. They spent all this time figuring out the first 7 things in the project, and they ran out of time for the 8th thing. We're telling our banks that you want to at least do 2 quarters simultaneous CECL and the current methodology to really start to be able to adjust to make it work. That's what we're doing for our 2020 banks. So once you've got all that figured out, you pull it together and build yourself a proposed timeline. You can lay this out. You can see in this example, there's in bold some high-level milestones and then some sub-drivers underneath, and then you can see they've got dates and colors that represent different resources and the like. So, it doesn't have to be much more complicated than this. I would say I'd want something a little more complicated than that just because I'd like to see some more detail from my management, but maybe this is what you report to the committee. So real quick, where are you now in this journey, in this project that is CECL transition? You know that there are now 2 paths. If you're a non-PBE, you've got till 2022. If you're a PBE, most cases, you're at 2020. So depending on which path you're on, you're going to have different tasks that you should be working. We believe that in 2019, the 2022 banks should be worrying about the project planning and management and the data, and then possibly looking at pooling methods. Then you'll get into building and buying models and testing the different impacts on capital. Certainly by 2020, best practices will be coming out from the larger banks because they'll be live, and we'll be able to fold that into your process as well. So things to do in 2019, you're looking at data gaps. You're looking at plugging those gaps through new data gathering processes, putting your data somewhere that's safe and auditable, so it's your data, not housed either on the core or in some vendor systems, so that you'll be able to use it and store it and slice and dice it as you have to. And possibly looking at your pool, your pooling, if you think you want to change it, it's something just to think about what are the different methods and how it might work. So that's a quick run through of a plan, and I know it's a lot to think about, but if you contact us, we can make this presentation available to you and talk to you a little about what you're doing to be CECL compliant. What we'd like to do now is have another poll because, again, we think that it's helpful to get a temperature of what our institutions are thinking and doing. So our second poll is really asking about what you think you're going to do next. I asked you in the beginning where you thought you were on the process. Now we're going to ask you to vote for us and step in and go ahead and say, what are you going to do next as a next step? I don't necessarily mean you're going to do this week, but you know, now that we're starting 2019 and we're mostly past the year end, what is it you're going to do next? And so we'll just take another minute to collect that. And then what we're going to do is really talk about, we'll give you 10 minutes on what the CECL solutions are that CSI has partnered with Ardmore and Argus to deliver, and see if they seem like they might be good fits for your institution. All right, we're going to give it one more minute. I think we got one more vote to go or two. Appreciate everybody taking the time to tell us what they're doing next. We're going to close it out now and show you the results, and you can see that, you know, a third are looking at data, a third are looking to build a plan, and some are already looking at third-party solutions, and some of you are continuing to wait and see. And if anybody wants my article that I had published in the American Banker about the wait and see attitude and the impact of that, I'm happy to send you a copy of that too. You can drop me an email and I'll send you the PDF of the article. Okay, lineage from the bank data transmitted to your data mart, Ardmore doing the data assessment, and then you can either go with the boot camp where you get live group instruction like this, peer discussion where you can talk to each other and share resources, monthly credit quality updates and white papers, or you go with a full solution, and with a full solution, you get all the modules, which includes your current ALLL automation if you choose, automated stress testing, which is a great way to be able to do justifiable modeling for losses in the future. Running a stress test or a sensitivity test can tell you what would happen if, and then you have an automated solution to show to your auditors and regulators, and also concentration management reporting. These are the choices that we offer you today. Real quick on the boot camp, I think we talked a lot about this. We will help you with your data. We understand CSI, obviously, having worked with them so long, and we understand really where small banks stand in resources to deal with CECL. So we will be your partner throughout the process. That's Ardmore Banking Advisors. And then you get that data collection tool. And the peer forum where you can actually communicate with other banks, and if you wish, ask them what they're hearing out there, getting opinions. You can also ask CECL experts questions, and they're public to everyone to see. We also have training updates that are ongoing. Where are you in the process, and the appropriate kind of presentations for where you are at this point in the journey. The boot camp has been going on for about a year now. You log in, you can access resources such as resources you can save, which might be things like white papers or webinars. You can also sort by different things. I mentioned the data quality reports. We'll look at the completeness of your data for key CECL attributes, and you'll be able to get an idea of where you need to improve. And it'll compare current to previous month. It'll look at percentages of change. We also will generate reports that'll tell you about how your data is sliced by collateral code and control category, and whether or not that seems like a sensible breakdown. we'll work with you on that as well. The full solution is a workflow-based solution. Any of you who are interested in seeing that, or the boot camp for that matter, can drop us a note and we can set you up on a GoToMeeting and we can show you over the web how these products work. The full solution allows you to do all of the CECL calculations, including setting up the pools, setting up individual impaired credits. It has all the controls. It's automatically linked to CSI, just like the boot camp. And it has, all the features you need, including supporting multiple CECL methodologies. It has the ability to pull in peer data. You can do all the different scenario tests that the regulators are expecting, and really a lot of reports. And probably the bulk of what I show in the presentation, although I can show screens like I did back there, is all the reports that are available that support your calculation, your Q factors, things like that. Reports like this, which would show your loss curve. We would be able to pull in, because with CSI we have history, we can actually show you where you are on your loss curve based on risk rating or the way you break up your pools. So it's, it's extremely nice to have the support that you need without having to build it yourself. It also will give you life of loan loss calculations like this. This is a CECL calculation, which for using vintage, where it's taking the losses each quarter and then creating a life of loan loss. In this example, you can see that what's in beige is your actual loss history. Of course, most of you would say, if I had that many losses in one asset pool from 2012 to 2017, I'd be out of business, but this is just an example. So these might be quarterly loss percentages, and then the gray might be your 4-quarter projection. So our product will do that projection for you. You also have the ability to put in your Q factors and impact that there. And then the way CECL works is it reverts to your life of loan history after your projection period is over. That's what's represented here in the green. So that's just a little picture of these things. I think the most important thing is to arm yourself with all the data you need, all the raw material you need when you're ready to get into the CECL process. So I'm going to wrap up with one more poll. And this is kind of an interesting one. What we're trying to get here from you is what you're really concerned about with CECL. And so this one, if you would be willing to look at some of the concerns you might have about CECL and what your biggest concerns are. So this one you can vote as many times as you want. So it's kind of like the mayor of Chicago back in the day, where you can vote early and often. What we'd love to have you do is tell us if you're concerned about any of these things in particular. Vote, just click on it. If you're not concerned, don't. If you're concerned about 2 or 3 of them, click on the ones that are most concerned to you. We're just trying to get a sense of what the industry is thinking about, what they're worried about most. So, like I said, click on any of them that you're concerned about. And if you're concerned about one in particular, you can go ahead and click on it twice. I think this is how we do chili cook-offs as well. So that'll work either way. So as we wrap up this poll, thanks again for participating. Hopefully this was useful to you. We think it is. And we're going to take another minute and then we'll show you the results of this poll. But I can tell you, if you're interested in learning more about how Ardmore can help you on your path, whether it's through consulting or advice, whether it's through the Argus solutions, contact your CSI account manager for your CSI bank, and they can route you to me, or you can go to me directly. All right, we're going to close down the poll. Thank you for participating. You can see that really resources are the biggest concern, although there are a number of concerns here, and a tie between not being sure exactly what you have to do and having a budget to get people to help you. So that's not too surprising, but thank you for participating. And just to close, this is my contact information. We are going to continue to do these kinds of things on at least a quarterly basis, particularly for your 2022 banks. to let you know, probably our next webinar, we'll start talking about, I think we've hit the data pretty well, so we're going to start talking about pooling. Thanks for your time, and again, drop me a note if you want any more information about CECL and the CSI partnership. Thanks, and have a great day.